Sometimes a man's worth isn't measured by what's in his wallet, but by what's in his hands and heart. Lucas Reyes knows this truth better than most, working alone in his father's old aircraft hangar, keeping a promise to a man who can no longer hear it. For 3 years, he's struggled to keep the family business alive, fixing planes for folks who barely have enough to pay him. When wealthy pilots arrive and mock his humble shop, they make him a cruel bet: fix an impossible wreck and keep it, or lose everything. Lucas has 30 days to restore a 1940s bush plane that hasn't flown in decades. He has no money, just his skill and determination. The rich men think they're watching a man about to fail. They don't know they're about to witness what happens when someone refuses to give up. What happens when Lucas discovers wartime secrets hidden in the plane's frame? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn crept through the grimy windows of Reyes Aviation Services, casting long shadows across a hangar that had seen better decades. Lucas Reyes stood at his workbench, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. At 34, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned that life's heaviest burdens were often invisible to the naked eye. The hangar smelled of motor oil, metal shavings, and the faint ghost of his father's Old Spice colonia scent that lingered in the fabric of the old coveralls hanging on a hook by the door. Those coveralls had belonged to Miguel Reyes, a man who could make any aircraft engine purr like a contented cat, and who had taught his son that there was no shame in honest work, only in work done poorly. Lucas opened the worn leather journal that sat permanently on his workbench. His father's handwriting filled every page, careful notes about engine specifications, sketches of mechanical solutions, and scattered wisdom about life. A mechanic's hands are his signature, Miguel had written on page 47. Every repair tells the world who you are. Lucas traced the words with his finger, feeling the slight indentations the pen had made in the paper 20 years ago. Rex, a German shepherd with intelligent brown eyes and a graying muzzle, lifted his head from his favorite spot near the space heater. The dog had wandered into Lucas's life 2 years ago, limping and half-starved, much like Lucas himself after Sarah had left. They had found each other at the right time, two souls who understood what it meant to be abandoned and who had decided that loyalty was worth more than promises. "Morning, boy," Lucas murmured, scratching behind Rex's ears. The dog's tail thumped against the concrete floor, the sound echoing in the cavernous space that felt too big for just one man and his dog. The hangar had been built in 1962, when Cedar Falls, Montana, had dreams of becoming a regional aviation hub. Those dreams had faded along with the town's population, but the building remained solid steel beams and corrugated siding that could withstand the mountain winds that howled down from the peaks every winter. Lucas had inherited it, along with his father's tools, his father's debt, and his father's unshakable belief that every broken thing deserved a chance at redemption. Outside, the town of Cedar Falls was waking up slowly. Population 847 on a good day, nestled in a valley where the Clark Fork River carved its way through pine-covered hills. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the grocery store still gave credit to families down on their luck, and where a man could disappear into his work without anyone asking too many questions. Lucas had been disappearing for 3 years now, ever since Sarah Patterson had decided that loving a man who talked more to airplane engines than to people was not the life she wanted. Her engagement ring still sat in the small safe behind his workbench, next to the deed to the hangar and his father's Purple Heart from Vietnam. Some treasures were too heavy to throw away and too painful to keep close. The morning routine never varied. Lucas would walk the perimeter of the hangar, checking for anything that might have shifted overnight, then review the day's work schedule, what little there was of it. Cedar Falls wasn't exactly a bustling aviation center, but there were enough crop dusters, private pilots, and the occasional emergency landing to keep food on the table. Barely. He pulled on his father's old coveralls, the fabric soft with age and permanent stains that told the story of 1,000 repairs. The name Miguel was still embroidered above the left breast pocket in fading blue thread. Lucas had never had his own name added. Some days it felt like he was just keeping the seat warm until his father came back to reclaim his life's work. The first customer of the day would be Joe Henderson, who flew a 1978 Cessna 172 that burned oil like a chain smoker and made concerning noises during takeoff. Joe had been coming to the hangar for 15 years, first to Miguel, now to Lucas. He was one of the few customers who paid on time and never questioned Lucas's recommendations. Lucas was checking the oil in Joe's plane when he heard the unmistakable sound of money approaching the low, expensive purr of turbine engines winding down. Through the open hangar door, he watched 3 aircraft taxi toward the small terminal, a sleek Citation jet, a pristine Beechcraft King Air, and a restored P-51 Mustang that probably cost more than Lucas would earn in 10 years. Rex's ears perked up, and he moved closer to Lucas, sensing tension in the air like an approaching storm. The dog had good instincts about people, better than Lucas's had been when it came to Sarah. The pilots who emerged from the aircraft moved with the casual arrogance of men who had never worried about paying rent. The leader was tall and silver-haired, wearing a leather flight jacket that probably cost more than Lucas's monthly mortgage payment. He surveyed the hangar with the dismissive gaze of someone accustomed to finding everything around him inadequate. "You must be Reyes," the man said, not bothering to extend his hand. "I'm Richard Blackstone. These are my associates, Marcus Webb and Diana Chase." Marcus was younger, maybe 40, with the precise bearing of an engineer who trusted numbers more than instincts. Diana was somewhere in between, with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. She was the only one who acknowledged Rex with a brief nod, which earned her a slight uptick in Lucas's estimation. "What can I do for you?" Lucas asked, setting down his wrench and wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. Blackstone smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're aviation enthusiasts, you might say. We collect vintage aircraft, restore them to museum quality. We heard you might be the man to talk to about finding hidden gems in this area." Lucas had heard about men like Blackstone wealthy collectors who treated vintage aircraft like trophies, caring more about ownership than the soul of the machines. They were the opposite of everything his father had taught him about, respecting the history and purpose of every plane that passed through their hands. "Depends on what you're looking for," Lucas said carefully. "Oh, we're not particular," Blackstone said, his tone casual in the way that usually preceded something unpleasant. "Though we did hear there's an old bush plane gathering dust at the municipal airport. Been sitting there for decades, I'm told." Lucas knew the plane they meant. Everyone in town did. A 1940s Stinson L5 Sentinel that had been abandoned so long it had become part of the landscape, like an old tree stump that everyone walked around without really seeing. It sat in the far corner of the airport property, covered in rust and decades of neglect, a monument to dreams deferred. "That old wreck?" Lucas shook his head. "She's been sitting there since before I was born. The weather and time have had their way with her." "Exactly," Blackstone said, his smile widening. "Which brings us to our proposition." Marcus stepped forward, pulling out a tablet and swiping through what looked like financial documents. "We understand you're having some difficulty keeping this place operational. Late payments on the mortgage, minimal customer base, equipment that's older than disco music." The words hit Lucas like a slap. His financial troubles weren't exactly secret in a town the size of Cedar Falls, but hearing them recited so casually felt like being stripped naked in public. "We'd like to make you a wager," Blackstone continued. "A gentleman's bet, you might say. You restore that Stinson to airworthy condition within 30 days, and we'll sign the title over to you, free and clear." Lucas felt his heart skip. A restored vintage aircraft would be worth a fortune, enough to pay off the hangar mortgage and keep the business alive for years. But men like Blackstone didn't give away fortunes without expecting something in return. "And if I can't?" Lucas asked, though he already knew the answer would be worse than he imagined. "Then you sign over the deed to this hangar to us," Blackstone said. "We have plans for the property. Nothing personal, you understand. Just business." Diana shifted uncomfortably, and Lucas caught her eye. For just a moment, he saw something that might have been sympathy, or perhaps regret. But it was gone so quickly he might have imagined it. 30 days, Marcus repeated, consulting his tablet. "Starting today. We'll have the paperwork drawn up by this afternoon." Lucas looked around the hangar that had been his father's dream and his own burden. The walls held decades of Memorish's father, teaching him to gap spark plugs, the first solar repair he'd completed at age 16, the night he'd stayed up until dawn, trying to save enough money to buy Sarah, an engagement ring she'd ultimately left behind. "Why?" Lucas asked. "Why make this offer?" Blackstone's smile turned predatory. "Let's just say we enjoy watching talented people reach their full potential. And if they can't, well, that tells us something important too." Rex growled low in his throat, the first sound he'd made since the strangers arrived. The dog's instincts were rarely wrong. But Lucas was thinking about the stack of overdue notices on his desk, the bank appointment he'd been avoiding for 2 weeks, and the slow, steady death of everything his father had built. Sometimes a man had to choose between certain failure and possible disaster. 30 days, he said, extending his hand to Blackstone. The handshake sealed more than a bet. It sealed Lucas's fate to 30 days of the most difficult work he'd ever attempted, with stakes higher than he'd ever faced. As the three strangers walked back to their expensive aircraft, Rex pressed close to Lucas's leg, offering the kind of loyalty that money couldn't buy. Lucas opened his father's journal to a random page and found a note that seemed written for this exact moment. "Sometimes the only way out is through, Mijo. When the work gets hard, remember why you started." He looked across the tarmac toward the forgotten corner where the old Stinson waited, and for the first time in 3 years, Lucas Reyes felt something stirring in his chest that might have been hope or might have been the first flutter of wings preparing for flight. The abandoned bush plane sat like a forgotten gravestone in the far corner of Cedar Falls Municipal Airport, where the weeds grew tall and the chain-link fence had rusted to match the autumn leaves. Lucas drove his battered pickup truck across the cracked tarmac, Rex riding shotgun with his nose pressed to the window, watching the world pass by with the patient wisdom of a dog who had learned that destinations mattered less than the journey. The Stinson L5 Sentinel had been beautiful once. Lucas could see it in the lines of her fuselage, the sweep of her wing, the proud angle of her tail. But that beauty was buried under layers of rust, neglect, and the slow violence of Montana weather. Her fabric covering hung in tatters, flapping in the morning breeze like prayer flags left too long in the wind. The engine cowling was dented and stained, and her landing gear sat at angles that suggested structural damage too extensive to calculate. Lucas parked beside the plane and sat in the truck for a long moment, letting the magnitude of the challenge wash over him. 30 days to restore something that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard. 30 days to save everything his father had built. 30 days to prove that skill and determination could triumph over money and arrogance. Rex whined softly, sensing his human's distress. The dog had an uncanny ability to read emotions, probably honed during his own dark days as a stray. Lucas scratched behind Rex's ears and opened the truck door. "Come on, boy. Let's go meet our new project." The closer Lucas got to the plane, the worse it looked. The prop was bent and corroded. The engine, visible through gaps in the cowling, showed cylinders green with oxidation, and the cockpit instruments were either missing or destroyed by years of exposure. Someone had long ago removed anything of value, leaving behind only the skeleton of what had once been a proud flying machine. But as Lucas walked around the aircraft, his mechanic's eye began to see past the damage to the bones beneath. The fuselage was straight, which meant the landing hadn't been catastrophic. The wing spars looked intact, though the fabric covering would need complete replacement. The engine was a Continental O170, a reliable power plant that Lucas had worked on before, assuming the block wasn't cracked and the internals weren't seized. He opened his father's journal to a section about wartime aircraft and found detailed notes about the L-5 Sentinel. Miguel had worked on several during his service in Vietnam, and his careful handwriting described them as honest planes that want to fly if you give them half a chance. Lucas pulled a small digital camera from his pocket and began documenting every inch of the aircraft. If he was going to attempt this restoration, he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with. The more he looked, the more he realized that this wasn't just a restoration, it was going to be a complete resurrection. The sound of expensive shoes on gravel made him look up. Blackstone, Webb, and Chase were approaching, having emerged from a black SUV that probably cost more than Lucas made in 2 years. "Having second thoughts?" Blackstone asked, his tone carrying the smug satisfaction of a man watching someone else's dreams crumble. "Just getting acquainted," Lucas replied, continuing his examination of the wing attachment points. Marcus Webb pulled out his tablet and began taking photos of his own. "You know, the insurance value on a restored L-5 is approximately $200,000, assuming museum, quality workmanship, and authentic components. Of course, authentic components for a 1940s aircraft are increasingly rare and expensive." Diana Chase stood apart from the other two, studying the plane with what looked like genuine interest rather than financial calculation. "What was her original mission?" she asked. Lucas consulted his father's notes. Liaison and reconnaissance. These planes were the eyes and ears of ground commanders during the war. They could land anywhere, take off from anywhere, and keep flying when everything else was grounded. "Assuming they could fly at all," Blackstone said with a laugh, "which this one obviously can't and won't. The structural integrity appears compromised," Marcus added, making notes on his tablet. "The restoration would require complete disassembly, new fabric covering, engine overhaul, instrument replacement, and regulatory certification. Even with unlimited resources, 30 days would be optimistic." Lucas felt the familiar fire that had carried him through every difficult repair his father had ever taught him to tackle. You might be surprised what's possible when someone actually cares about the work. "Caring doesn't replace corroded aluminum or seized engines," Marcus replied. "This is basic materials science." But Diana was looking at Lucas with curious eyes. "You really think you can do this?" For a moment, Lucas saw past her expensive clothes and perfect makeup to something that might have been hope. It reminded him of the way children looked at magicians, wanting to believe in impossible things. "I think this plane wants to fly again," Lucas said. "The question is whether she'll trust me enough to let me help her." Blackstone and Marcus exchanged glances that spoke of easy money and entertainment at Lucas's expense. But Diana continued studying both the plane and the man who thought he could save it. "The contract will be ready this afternoon," Blackstone said. 30 days from today. Not a minute longer." After they left, Lucas climbed into the cockpit and sat in the pilot's seat. The leather was cracked and faded, but he could imagine it new, could picture the pilot who had last sat here thinking about home and hoping to live long enough to see it again. Every vintage aircraft carried the ghosts of everyone who had ever trusted their life to its wings. Rex jumped into the passenger seat, his weight causing the old springs to groan in protest. The dog settled down as if he belonged there, watching Lucas with patient brown eyes that seemed to say, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." Lucas opened his father's journal to a page he'd read 100 times, but never truly understood until now. Every broken thing teaches you something if you listen carefully enough. The ones that seem most hopeless often have the strongest will to live. He climbed out of the cockpit and began a more thorough inspection, taking measurements and making notes in the margins of his father's journal. The prop would need to be completely replaced. The engine would require a complete teardown and rebuild. The fabric covering was beyond salvage. The instruments were missing or destroyed. The fuel system would need to be rebuilt from scratch. By any reasonable standard, the restoration was impossible. But Lucas had never been entirely reasonable, and his father had taught him that impossible was just another word for nobody's tried hard enough yet. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Lucas made his decision. He would sign the contract. He would bet everything on 30 days and a pile of rust that had once been someone's pride and joy. Rex seemed to approve, his tail wagging as they walked back to the truck. Sometimes the only way to honor the past was to risk everything for the future, and sometimes a man found his true measure not in his successes, but in what he was willing to attempt when failure seemed certain. The abandoned bush plane sat in the gathering darkness, waiting for someone to believe in second chances. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The contract sat on Lucas's workbench like a coiled snake. 3 pages of legal language that boiled down to a simple proposition: perform a miracle or lose everything. He'd signed it that afternoon, his signature looking small and vulnerable next to Blackstone's aggressive scrawl. Now, at 5 in the morning, Lucas stood in his hangar organizing tools he hadn't touched in years. The restoration would require every skill his father had taught him, and several he'd have to learn as he went. He'd moved the Stinson into the hangar the previous evening, using Joe Henderson's tractor and a flatbed trailer that groaned under the weight of even this small aircraft. Rex lay on his favorite blanket, watching Lucas sort through boxes of spare parts with the patient attention of a supervisor who knew better than to interrupt important work. The dog had accepted the plane's presence with the same philosophical calm he brought to most changes in their routine. Lucas opened his toolbox to retrieve a set of calipers and found Sarah's letter tucked beneath his father's old combination square. The envelope was wrinkled from handling, though he couldn't remember the last time he'd deliberately looked at it. Her handwriting on the outside was careful and neat, just like everything else about Sarah Patterson. "Lucas," the letter began, "I know you'll read this someday when you're ready to understand why I had to leave." He'd read it a dozen times in the first month after she'd gone, and once or twice a year since then, usually when loneliness got the better of his judgment. "You love those planes more than you could ever love me," Sarah had written. "I used to think I could compete with engines and rivets and your father's memory, but I was wrong. You live in that hangar like it's a shrine, and there's no room for anyone else in your worship." The words still stung, partly because they weren't entirely unfair. Lucas had spent their last year together working longer hours, taking on more difficult projects, anything to avoid the conversations Sarah wanted to have about their future. He'd thought he was building something for them. She'd seen it as him choosing his past over their present. "I hope someday you find someone who understands that part of you," the letter concluded. "But I can't be her. I need someone who chooses me first, not someone who fits me into the spaces between his real priorities." Lucas folded the letter and tucked it back into the toolbox. Sarah had been gone for 3 years, but her words echoed in the empty spaces of the hangar where her laughter used to live. The sound of footsteps on gravel interrupted his brooding. Through the open hangar door, he saw a woman approaching, with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being where she belonged. She was probably 30, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wearing jeans that suggested she wasn't afraid of getting dirty. "Mr. Reyes," she called out. "I'm Elena Martinez. I heard about your project." Lucas wiped his hands on a rag and stepped forward. "News travels fast in Cedar Falls." Elena smiled, and Lucas noticed that her eyes held the kind of warmth that made people want to trust her. "I'm the new elementary school teacher. I've been in town for 2 months, and this is the most exciting thing that's happened since I arrived." "Exciting might not be the word I'd use," Lucas said, gesturing toward the plane. "Terrifying comes closer." Elena walked around the Stinson with the careful attention of someone who appreciated craftsmanship, even when it was hidden under layers of neglect. She ran her fingers along the wing spar, where the fabric had rotted away, revealing the aluminum skeleton beneath. "She's beautiful," Elena said, and Lucas heard genuine appreciation in her voice. "She will be," Lucas corrected. "Right now she's more like a very expensive pile of scrap metal." Rex had wandered over to investigate the newcomer, and Elena knelt to scratch behind his ears. The dog's tail wagged with the enthusiasm reserved for people who passed his mysterious character assessment. "I have a confession," Elena said, straightening up. I've always been fascinated by aviation, but I've never actually been in a small plane. My grandfather was a pilot in Korea, and he used to tell me stories about flying that made it sound like magic. Lucas found himself warming to her obvious sincerity. It is magic, in a way. Every time you convince a few tons of metal to leave the ground, you're arguing with gravity and winning. Would you? Elena hesitated, then pressed forward with the determination of someone accustomed to taking conversational risks. Would you mind if I helped? I know I don't have any mechanical experience, but I'm good at research, and I have more free time than I know what to do with. The offer surprised Lucas. In the 3 years since Sarah had left, he'd grown accustomed to solitude. Having another person in his workspace would mean conversation, explanation, the possibility of someone else's expectations to manage. But Elena was looking at the plane with the same mixture of hope and determination that Lucas felt stirring in his own chest, and Rex had already adopted her as a friend worth keeping. I could use help with research, Lucas admitted. There are probably parts, catalogs, and technical manuals that would be useful, and someone who knows how to organize information better than I do. Elena's face lit up with a smile that transformed her from merely pretty to genuinely radiant. Perfect. I love organizing information. It's one of the few advantages of being a teacher. You learn to break complex problems into manageable pieces. Lucas showed her around the hangar, explaining his father's organizational system and pointing out the resources he'd already identified. Elena asked intelligent questions about the restoration process and took notes in a small notebook she pulled from her back pocket. "What's the biggest challenge going to be?" she asked, studying the engine compartment. Lucas considered the question seriously. "Finding parts. A lot of the original components aren't manufactured anymore, so I'll have to either rebuild what's here or fabricate replacements. The engine alone has about 300 individual parts, and half of them are probably beyond saving. But you have experience with this kind of work?" "Some," Lucas said, thinking of the dozens of vintage aircraft he'd helped his father restore, "though nothing this old or this far gone. Dad always said that every plane teaches you something new about what's possible." Elena spent the next hour helping Lucas catalog the plane's components, making careful notes about what could be salvaged and what would need replacement. Her teacher's instincts for organization transformed his scattered observations into a systematic assessment that revealed both the scope of the challenge and potential solutions. As they worked, Lucas found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't since Sarah had left. Elena's presence didn't feel intrusive or demanding. She seemed content to learn by watching and listening, offering help without needing to control the process. When she finally left that evening, promising to return the next day with research about parts, suppliers, and technical specifications, Lucas realized that the hangar felt different. Not empty, exactly, but expectant, as if the space itself was looking forward to her return. Rex settled onto his blanket with a contented sigh, having apparently decided that Elena Martinez was a welcome addition to their small pack. Lucas opened his father's journal to make notes about the day's progress and found himself writing not just about corroded components and missing parts, but about the unexpected gift of someone who looked at his impossible project and saw possibility instead of failure. Sometimes the help you needed arrived in forms you didn't expect, carrying gifts you didn't know you were missing. 1 week into the restoration, Lucas stood in his father's old workshop behind the main hangar, studying a piece of equipment he hadn't touched in 5 years. The propeller Huber masterwork of precision machining that Miguel Reyes had crafted by hand in 1987 gleamed under the fluorescent lights like a mechanical jewel. His father had made the hub during the restoration of a 1941 Stearman biplane, spending 3 months shaping and machining the aluminum until every curve was perfect, every tolerance exact. The customer had changed his mind halfway through the project and bought a factory-rebuilt hub instead, leaving Miguel with a work of art that had no airplane to call home. "Why keep it?" young Lucas had asked, watching his father carefully wrap the hub in oiled cloth. "Because someday," Miguel had said, "the right airplane will need it. Good work is never wasted, my Joe. It just waits for its moment. That moment had arrived. The Stinson's original hub was corroded beyond repair, and finding a replacement would cost more money than Lucas had and take more time than he could spare. But his father's creation would fit perfectly with minor modifications, a gift from the past that made the impossible slightly more possible. Elena arrived as Lucas was setting up the lathe, carrying a cardboard box and wearing a smile that had become as familiar as sunrise over the past week. She'd proven to be everything she'd promised: organized, intelligent, and possessed of a teacher's gift for breaking complex problems into manageable steps. "I brought breakfast," she announced, setting the box on the workbench. "And news from the library." Rex appeared from beneath the wing, where he'd been supervising Lucas's morning inspection, his tail wagging at the sight of Elena. The dog had adopted her completely, often positioning himself between Elena and Lucas, as if he were facilitating some sort of interspecies diplomacy. Elena unpacked homemade biscuits, local honey, and coffee that actually tasted like it had been brewed this century, instead of merely reheated from yesterday's pot. Lucas realized he'd been eating nothing but sandwiches and gas station coffee since the project began. "This is incredible," he said, biting into a biscuit that was somehow both fluffy and substantial. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My grandmother," Elena said, settling onto a shop stool beside the workbench. "She believed that good food was the foundation of all other good things. Feed people well," she used to say, "and they'll remember that kindness long after they've forgotten your words." As they ate, Elena spread out copies of documents she'd discovered in the town library's archives. "I found the original registration papers for your plane," she said, pointing to a yellowed form from 1943. Her name was Montana Bell, and she was stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base during the war. Lucas studied the documents with growing interest. The plane had a history he hadn't known about: specific missions, recorded flight hours, even the names of pilots who had trusted their lives to her wings. One name appeared more frequently than others: Captain James Harrison, who had flown Montana Bell on reconnaissance missions over the Pacific Northwest. "There's more," Elena said, pulling out a photograph that made Lucas's breath catch. The picture showed Montana Bell in her prime fabric covering, taut and gleaming, engine cowling polished to mirror brightness, sitting on a military airfield with mountains visible in the background. Captain Harrison stood beside her, wearing a leather flight jacket and the confident smile of a young man who believed he was invincible. "She was beautiful," Lucas whispered, seeing past the rust and neglect of the proud aircraft she'd once been. Elena leaned closer to study the photograph, and Lucas caught the scent of her shampoo, something floral and clean that reminded him of spring meadows. "The question is," she said, "can she be beautiful again?" "With the right parts and enough time, absolutely," Lucas said, trying to ignore the way his pulse quickened when Elena's shoulder brushed against his. "The challenge is finding authentic components. I can fabricate some things, but others need to be original, or at least period correct." Elena pulled out her notebook, filled with neat handwriting and carefully organized research. "I've been contacting aviation museums and vintage aircraft dealers. Most of the responses haven't been encouraging. Parts for 1940s aircraft are rare and expensive, but I did find one possibility." She showed him a printout of an email from a collector in Oregon who specialized in wartime liaison aircraft. He had several L-5 Sentinels in various stages of restoration and might be willing to sell or trade components. "The problem," Elena said, "is that he wants to see proof that we're serious about the restoration before he'll quote prices. He's had too many people waste his time with projects they couldn't complete." Lucas understood the collector's caution. The vintage aviation community was small and protective, wary of amateurs who bought aircraft they couldn't afford to restore properly. But proving seriousness would require showing progress, and progress required parts. He didn't yet have a perfect circle of catch-22 logic. "There might be another way," Lucas said, gesturing toward his father's propeller hub. "If I can demonstrate that level of craftsmanship, it might convince him we're not just dreamers with more enthusiasm than skill." Elena studied the hub with the careful attention she brought to everything. "Your father made this? Every curve, every angle," Lucas said, running his fingers along the polished aluminum. "It took him 3 months of evenings and weekends. He said it was good practice, but I think he just loved the work for its own sake." "It's extraordinary," Elena said, and Lucas heard genuine awe in her voice. "I've never seen anything like it." Lucas felt a flush of pride that surprised him with its intensity. He'd grown so accustomed to working alone that he'd forgotten the pleasure of sharing his father's legacy with someone who could appreciate its true value. "Teaching must be similar," he said. "Taking raw material in your case, young mind sand, shaping them into something better than they were." Elena smiled, but there was something wistful in her expression. "Sometimes, though children are more forgiving than aircraft engines, they don't stop working if you make a mistake." "What brought you to Cedar Falls?" Lucas asked, realizing he knew remarkably little about her life beyond her willingness to help with his impossible project. Elena was quiet for a moment, staring at the photograph of Montana Belle in her glory days. "A fresh start," she said finally. "Sometimes you need to go somewhere no one knows your history to figure out who you want to become." Lucas understood that feeling better than she probably realized. After Sarah had left, he'd considered leaving Cedar Falls himself, selling the hangar, taking his father's tools, and starting over somewhere his past wouldn't follow him to work every morning. "Why stay?" Elena asked, as if reading his thoughts. "You could work anywhere with skills like yours." Lucas looked around the workshop, where his father had taught him that honest work was its own reward, where every tool held memories of lessons learned and problems solved together. Because leaving would mean giving up on everything Dad built, and because some promises are too important to break, even when keeping them is harder than you thought it would be. Elena nodded as if she understood exactly what he meant. Sometimes the most important promises are the ones we make to people who can't hold us accountable anymore. They worked together for the rest of the morning, Elena organizing documentation, while Lucas began the delicate process of modifying his father's propeller hub to fit the Stinson specifications. The work required precision and patience, qualities his father had insisted were more valuable than speed or strength. When Elena left that afternoon, promising to follow up with the Oregon collector, Lucas realized that the hangar felt more alive than it had in years. Not just because of the restoration project, but because someone else now shared his investment in seeing Montana Belle fly again. Rex settled beside the workbench with a contented sigh, apparently satisfied that the pack was growing in the right direction. Lucas opened his father's journal to record the day's progress and found himself writing about more than just technical challenges and mechanical solutions. Some gifts arrived, wrapped in unexpected packages, and some partnerships formed not through grand gestures, but through the quiet sharing of important work. 15 days into the restoration, Lucas made a discovery that changed everything he thought he knew about Montana Belle. He was removing the last of the rotted fabric from the fuselage when his fingers found something that shouldn't have been there, a small access panel hidden beneath layers of old covering, so carefully concealed that it was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The panel opened to reveal a compartment no bigger than a shoebox, lined with lead sheeting and containing equipment that Lucas recognized from his father's war stories. Radio gear, but not the standard communication equipment that belonged in a liaison aircraft. This was specialized hardware frequency scanners, encryption devices, and a compact transmitter that looked like it had been designed for intelligence work rather than routine military communications. "Elena," Lucas called, his voice tight with excitement and confusion. "You need to see this." Elena appeared from behind the wing where she'd been cataloging salvageable instruments, her notebook in hand and a pencil tucked behind her ear. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd become as invested in the restoration as Lucas himself, arriving early each morning and staying late into the evening to help with research and organization. "What did you find?" she asked, moving to peer into the hidden compartment. "Something that explains why this plane was abandoned instead of sold for scrap." Lucas said, carefully removing one of the radio devices. Montana Bell wasn't just a liaison aircraft, she was running intelligence operations. Elena studied the equipment with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. During World War II. Has to be, Lucas said, consulting his father's journal for references to similar gear. Dad worked on electronics like this in Vietnam. It's primitive by modern standards, but in 1943, this would have been cutting-edge spy equipment. Elena pulled out her phone and began photographing the devices from multiple angles. This could explain why the plane was classified and then forgotten. If it was involved in sensitive operations, the military might have intentionally lost track of it after the war. Lucas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana morning. Which means we might be restoring something that people in high places wanted to stay buried. They spent the rest of the morning carefully documenting everything in the hidden compartment. Elena's teacher instincts for systematic investigation proved invaluable. She photographed each device, noted its position, and created detailed sketches of how everything connected. Lucas focused on the technical aspects, trying to understand what the equipment had been designed to do. The frequency ranges are interesting, Lucas said, studying the settings on one of the scanners. These aren't military communication frequencies. They're commercial bands, the kind used by civilian radio stations and telephone companies. Elena looked up from her notebook. So Montana Bell was eavesdropping on civilian communications. Domestic surveillance, Lucas said, the implications settling over him like a dark cloud. During wartime, the government monitored everything: radio broadcasts, telephone calls, telegraph messages. They were looking for spies, saboteurs, anyone who might be working for the enemy. Elena sat back on her heels, processing what they'd discovered. And after the war, when that kind of surveillance became politically uncomfortable, they made the plane disappear. Along with any records of what it had been doing, Lucas added. Which is why there's no maintenance history, no transfer documents, no explanation of how a military aircraft ended up abandoned at a civilian airport. Rex had been watching their investigation with the patient attention of a dog who understood that important discoveries required careful handling. Now he moved closer to Lucas, pressing his warm bulk against his human's leg in the way that meant comfort was needed. Lucas appreciated the dog's instincts. The discovery of the intelligence equipment had transformed Montana Bell from a challenging restoration project into something far more complicated. Every vintage aircraft carried history, but this plane carried secrets that someone had gone to considerable trouble to hide. Elena stood and walked to the hangar's open door, staring out at the mountains that surrounded Cedar Falls. "The question is," she said without turning around, "what do we do with this information?" Lucas joined her at the door, following her gaze toward the peaks where snow was already beginning to accumulate, despite the early autumn date. "We restore the plane," he said. "Whatever Montana Bell was used for, that's not what she was built for. She was built to fly, and that's what we're going to help her do again." Elena turned to study his profile. Even if it means stirring up secrets that powerful people wanted to keep buried. Lucas thought about his father's journal, filled with stories of aircraft that had served in ways their designers never intended: bombers converted to cargo haulers, fighters modified for reconnaissance, civilian planes pressed into military service. Every aircraft was capable of redemption if someone cared enough to look past its history to its true purpose. "Especially then," he said, "Montana Bell deserves better than being remembered as a spy plane. She deserves to be remembered as what she really is: a machine built to connect people across distances, to serve and protect, to prove that humans can overcome gravity and geography through ingenuity and courage." Elena smiled, and Lucas saw approval in her expression, spoken like someone who understands that the most important thing about any tool is how you choose to use it. They returned to work with renewed purpose, but the discovery had changed the atmosphere in the hangar. The restoration was no longer just about winning a bet or saving Lucas's business. It was about reclaiming Montana Bell's true identity, about proving that aircraft like people could transcend the purposes others had assigned them. As the afternoon wore on, Elena began researching the history of domestic surveillance during World War II, trying to understand the context for what they'd found. Lucas focused on the mechanical challenges, but he found his mind wandering to questions about the pilots who had flown these secret missions. Had Captain James Harrison known what he was really doing when he took Montana Bell on those reconnaissance flights? Had he volunteered for intelligence work, or had he been following orders without understanding their full implications? "I found something," Elena said, looking up from her laptop. There were several domestic surveillance programs during the war, most of them classified until the 1970s. One was called Operation Nightwatch, monitoring civilian communications for signs of enemy infiltration or sabotage. Lucas paused in his work cleaning corroded wiring. Montana Bell was part of Operation Nightwatch. "It fits the time frame and the equipment," Elena said. Aircraft would patrol communication corridors, intercepting radio transmissions and telephone calls, looking for coded messages or suspicious patterns. The program was shut down after the war, and the records were sealed. "Until someone decided that sealing wasn't enough," Lucas said. "So they made the planes disappear too." Elena closed her laptop and looked at the hidden compartment, now empty of its secret cargo. "The question is whether anyone is still interested in keeping those secrets buried." Lucas thought about Blackstone's sudden interest in a worthless wreck, about the timing of the bet and the generous terms that seemed too good to be true. "I think," he said slowly, "that we may have just figured out why Richard Blackstone really wants access to this plane." Rex whined softly, picking up on the tension that was radiating from both humans. Elena moved to the dog and scratched behind his ears, her touch gentle, but her expression troubled. "If Blackstone knows about the intelligence equipment," she said, "then this bet was never about testing your skills. It was about getting legal access to whatever Montana Bell might still be hiding." Lucas felt the familiar anger that had sustained him through every challenge his father had ever set before him. Someone was trying to use him, trying to manipulate his desperation to save the hangar for their own hidden purposes. But they had underestimated both his skill and his determination to see Montana Bell restored to her true purpose. "Then we'd better make sure," Lucas said, "that when Montana Bell flies again, she's flying for the right reasons." The wartime radio equipment sat on the workbench like evidence in a trial that hadn't been scheduled yet, waiting for someone to decide whether the past was worth preserving or whether some secrets were better left buried beneath layers of rust and time. 21 days into the restoration, Elena arrived at the hangar, carrying a small bronze medal wrapped in tissue paper and wearing the expression of someone who had discovered something extraordinary. Lucas was elbow-deep in Montana Bell's engine compartment, trying to free a seized piston that had been corroded in place for decades when he heard her footsteps on the concrete floor. "Lucas," she said, her voice carrying an excitement that made him look up immediately, "I found something at the town library that changes everything we know about Cedar Falls." Rex lifted his head from his favorite spot beneath the wing, tail thumping against the floor in greeting. Over the past 3 weeks, the dog had come to associate Elena's arrivals with interesting discoveries and excellent food, both of which improved the quality of life in the hangar considerably. Elena unwrapped the medal carefully, revealing a bronze disc suspended from a faded ribbon. The inscription read, "Pioneer Aviation Award, Theodore Cedar, 1923. The reverse side showed a biplane in flight over mountain peaks, with the words, "First Flight, Cedar Falls Valley," engraved in flowing script. "Theodore Cedar," Elena said, settling onto her usual stool beside the workbench. "The man who founded this town. He wasn't just a homesteader, Lucas. He was a pilot." Lucas wiped his hands on a rag and examined the medal more closely. The craftsmanship was exceptional, the kind of detailed work that spoke of genuine recognition rather than a participation trophy. "Where did you find this?" "In a box of uncatalogued donations in the library basement," Elena said, pulling out her notebook. "Along with this." She showed him a photograph of a young man standing beside a small biplane, mountains visible in the background. The plane was primitive by modern standards, but the pride on the pilot's face was unmistakable. Theodore Cedar made the first powered flight in this valley in 1923, Elena continued. He built his own airplane from plans he ordered through the mail, taught himself to fly, and spent 2 years mapping the area from the air. The town was named after him, but somehow the aviation connection was forgotten. Lucas studied the photograph with growing amazement. The landscape was recognizable, the same mountains, the same river valley, even the same stand of pine trees where the municipal airport now sat. But in 1923, it had been wilderness, and Theodore Cedar had been the first person to see it from the sky. "There's more," Elena said, her excitement building. Cedar founded the town specifically to support aviation. He believed that small aircraft would revolutionize transportation in remote areas, that places like this valley could be connected to the wider world through flight rather than just roads and railroads. Lucas set down his tools, giving Elena his full attention. "So Cedar Falls was designed to be an aviation community from the beginning?" "Exactly," Elena said, consulting her notes. Cedar laid out the original town with the airport at its center. He recruited other pilots and aircraft mechanics to settle here. By 1930, Cedar Falls had more registered aircraft per capita than anywhere else in Montana. What happened to change that? Elena's expression grew somber. The Depression, and then the war. Young pilots enlisted or were drafted. Aircraft were sold to help families survive financially. Theodore Cedar himself died in a flying accident in 1936, and with him went most of the town's aviation leadership. Lucas felt a chill of recognition, and gradually people forgot that this place was built on dreams of flight. "Until now," Elena said softly, "your restoration of Montana Belle is reminding everyone of what Cedar Falls used to be and what it could be again." As if summoned by their conversation, Lucas heard vehicles approaching the hangar. Through the open door, he saw a small procession of cars and trucks pulling into the parking area. Joe Henderson emerged from his battered pickup, followed by Martha Peterson from the diner, Tom Bradley, who ran the hardware store, and at least a dozen other townspeople Lucas recognized. "Word's getting around," Elena said, watching the impromptu gathering with satisfaction. "People are starting to remember that they live in a place that was founded on the belief that ordinary people could do extraordinary things." Joe Henderson approached the hangar with the respectful manner of someone entering a church. "Lucas," he said, removing his cap, "we heard about what you're doing here. Thought you could use some help." Martha stepped forward, carrying a large thermos and a basket that smelled like fresh baking. "Been too long since this town had something to be proud of," she said. "Figure feeding folks properly is the least we can do." Tom Bradley was examining Montana Belle with the careful eye of someone who understood mechanical challenges. "That engine's going to need a complete rebuild," he observed. "I've got some machine tools at the store that might be useful, and my grandson's studying mechanical engineering at the university. He's been looking for a hands-on project for his senior thesis." Over the next hour, the informal gathering grew into an impromptu planning session. Elena had somehow transformed from research assistant into community organizer, coordinating offers of help and resources with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex projects. Mrs. Chen, who taught high school physics, was fascinated by the engineering challenges and wanted to bring her advanced students to observe the restoration process. Bob Williams, a retired machinist, offered to help with precision metalwork. Even old Frank Morrison, who hadn't spoken to Lucas since a disagreement over a repair bill 2 years ago, shambled over to mumble an offer to help with fabric covering. "This isn't just about fixing one airplane anymore," Elena said quietly, standing beside Lucas as they watched the townspeople examine Montana Belle with growing enthusiasm. "It's about restoring something that the whole community lost." Lucas nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over him like a familiar jacket. "My father always said that the best repairs were the ones that made something stronger than it was originally." "Maybe that's true for communities too," Elena said. As the crowd gradually dispersed, each person taking with them a piece of the excitement and purpose that had filled the hangar, Lucas realized that the restoration had evolved beyond his original desperate gamble. Montana Bell was becoming a symbol of what was possible when people chose to believe in something larger than their individual limitations. Elena stayed after the others had left, helping Lucas organize the offers of assistance and resources. Her notebook had grown thick with contact information, schedules, and coordination details that transformed chaos into manageable components. "You know," she said, pausing in her note, taking to study Lucas's profile as he worked, "when I came to Cedar Falls, I was running away from something. But watching you refuse to give up on this plane, seeing how the whole community is rallying around your projected makes me want to run towards something instead." Lucas looked up from the engine component he'd been cleaning. "And what would that be?" Elena smiled, and in her expression Lucas saw the same mixture of hope and determination that he felt every time he looked at Montana Bell. The possibility that home isn't just a place you're from, but a place where you choose to invest your best efforts. Rex stretched and yawned, apparently satisfied that the day's developments were proceeding according to his approval. The dog had been watching the growing crowd with the diplomatic attention of an ambassador, accepting scratches and treats from visitors while maintaining his primary loyalty to Lucas and Elena. As evening settled over the hangar, Lucas opened his father's journal to record the day's progress. But instead of technical notes about pistons and fuel lines, he found himself writing about community and connection, about how the act of restoring something broken could inspire others to remember their own capacity for renewal. Theodore Cedar's medal sat on the workbench beside Montana Bell's engine, a reminder that the dreams supporting this restoration were older and deeper than Lucas had realized. Some traditions were worth preserving, and some communities were worth rebuilding, one careful repair at a time. 23 days into the restoration, with 1 week remaining until the deadline, Lucas discovered that everything he thought he knew about Richard Blackstone's motives had been wrong. The revelation came hidden in a waterproof pouch tucked behind the radio equipment compartment, a manila envelope containing documents that had been waiting 78 years for someone to find them. Elena was photographing the final installation of the rebuilt fuel system when Lucas's fingers found the concealed pouch. The envelope inside was sealed with wax and marked with military stamps that had faded to illegibility. Inside were 3 items: a set of encrypted mission orders, a hand-drawn map of the Cedar Falls area, and a typed intelligence report dated October 15, 1945. "Elena," Lucas called, his voice tight with the kind of controlled urgency that made her look up immediately from her documentation. "I think we just found out why Blackstone really wanted this plane." Elena moved to the workbench where Lucas had spread out the documents. The mission orders were in military code, but the intelligence report was written in clear English that made its implications impossible to ignore. "Operation Nightwatch Asset Recovery," Elena read aloud. "Primary objective: secure and transport classified documents related to domestic surveillance operations. Secondary objective: ensure complete operational security through asset disposal protocols." Lucas pointed to a paragraph halfway down the page. "Look at this. Subject aircraft contains complete operational records for surveillance activities conducted between June 1943 and September 1945. Records include target lists, transcription logs, and evidence files for approximately 400 American civilians investigated for potential enemy collaboration." Elena's face went pale as she continued reading. "Lucas, this says the plane was carrying evidence that could have destroyed thousands of innocent people's lives. Lists of Americans who were investigated as potential spies, including recordings of their private conversations and correspondence. And according to this final paragraph," Lucas said, his voice grim, "the plane disappeared during a transfer flight to a disposal facility where everything was supposed to be destroyed. The pilot and the evidence just vanished." Elena studied the hand-drawn map, which showed the Cedar Falls area with X marks indicating several locations around the valley. What do you think these marks represent? Lucas compared the map to his knowledge of local geography. Possible crash sites, maybe, or hiding places. Someone was looking for this plane very systematically. The implications settled over them like a storm cloud. Montana Bell hadn't been abandoned. She'd been hidden by someone who understood that the evidence she carried was too dangerous to let fall into the wrong hands. For nearly 80 years, she'd been protecting the secrets of Americans who had been investigated without their knowledge during the war. "Blackstone knows," Elena said, the certainty in her voice making Lucas's blood run cold. "Somehow, he knows what's really hidden in this plane, and it's not just historical curiosity. Someone wants those files." Lucas thought about Blackstone's behavior during their encounters, the casual arrogance, the certainty that Lucas would fail, the legal precision of the contract that gave Blackstone access to the plane, regardless of the bet's outcome. He never expected me to succeed with the restoration. He just needed a legal way to search the aircraft thoroughly. "But why now?" Elena asked. "After all these years, why is this suddenly important?" Lucas studied the intelligence report more carefully, noting details he'd missed on first reading. "Look at some of these names," he said, pointing to a partial list attached to the main document. "Senator Morrison, Judge Patterson, General Bradley. These aren't random civilians. These are people who went on to hold positions of power after the war." Elena's eyes widened as she recognized some of the surnames. "Pattersonas in Sarah Patterson, your ex-fiancé? Morrison like Frank Morrison, who owns the largest ranch in the county? Bradley Tom, Bradley who runs the hardware store. Their grandparents and great-grandparents," Lucas confirmed. "People whose families have been pillars of this community for generations. If evidence surfaced that they'd been investigated as potential enemy collaborators, even if they were completely innocent, it could destroy reputations and political careers that have been built over decades." Elena sat down heavily on her usual stool, processing the magnitude of what they'd discovered. "So this isn't about money or collectible aircraft. This is about political leverage. Someone wants the power to destroy or protect powerful families based on what's in these files." Rex had been watching their conversation with the patient attention of a dog who understood that serious discussions required careful listening. Now he moved closer to Lucas, pressing his warm bulk against his human's leg in the gesture that meant comfort was needed. Lucas appreciated the dog's instincts. The discovery had transformed their restoration project from a personal challenge into something far more dangerous. They were no longer just fixing an old airplane. They were sitting on evidence that could change lives and political fortunes. "We have choices to make," Lucas said, looking at Montana Bell with new understanding. "We could turn these documents over to Blackstone and walk away. We could destroy them ourselves and pretend we never found them. Or we could figure out the right thing to do with information this powerful." Elena stood and walked to the hangar's open door, staring out at the town where they'd both found something worth protecting. "What would your father have done?" Lucas opened Miguel's journal to a page he'd read many times, but never truly understood until now. Sometimes the most important decision a man makes is not what to fix, but what to leave broken. Some things are dangerous when they work too well. "Dad always said that aircraft were tools," Lucas said slowly. "The most important thing about any tool is not what it can do, but how you choose to use it. The same principle applies to information." Elena turned back toward him, and Lucas saw resolve forming in her expression. Those families have been living with this shadow hanging over them for 78 years without even knowing it. They deserve to know the truth, and they deserve to control what happens to that truth. Lucas nodded, feeling the rightness of her instinct. "We finish the restoration. We get Montana Bell flying again. And then we decide what to do with her secrets based on what's best for the people whose lives they affect, not what's most convenient for people like Blackstone." Elena smiled, and Lucas saw approval in her expression. Spoken like someone who understands that the most important repairs are the ones that fix things that were broken long before you found them. As they returned to work, The encrypted mission orders sat on the workbench like evidence in a trial that hadn't been scheduled yet. Montana Bell carried more than just wartime secrets. She carried the power to heal old wounds or inflict new ones, depending on who controlled her legacy. With 7 days remaining until the deadline, Lucas realized that winning Blackstone's bet had become secondary to a more important challenge, ensuring that when Montana Bell finally flew again, she would be serving justice rather than enabling manipulation. The wartime radio equipment and the hidden documents represented two different kinds of surveillance that had been imposed on innocent people without their knowledge, and one that now gave those people's descendants the power to decide their own fate. Sometimes the most important discoveries were the ones that forced you to choose between what was easy and what was right. 27 days into the restoration, Lucas worked through the night by the light of shop lamps that cast dancing shadows across Montana Bell's nearly completed form. In his hands was his father's original flight manual for the L5 Sentinel water damaged, but readable, with Miguel's careful annotations filling the margins like a conversation across time. Elena dozed fitfully in a chair beside the workbench, her notebook open to a page of calculations and phone numbers that represented the community's growing investment in the project. Over the past week, Cedar Falls had transformed from a collection of individuals into something resembling the aviation community Theodore Cedar had originally envisioned. Rex lay beneath the wing, positioned where he could watch both humans and the hangar entrance simultaneously. The dog's protective instincts had sharpened since the discovery of the hidden documents, as if he understood that they were now guarding something more valuable and dangerous than a restored aircraft. Lucas found the passage he'd been searching for in his father's manual, Miguel's notes about pre-flight procedures for aircraft that had been stored for extended periods. When an airplane has been sleeping for too long, his father had written, "You have to wake it up gently." Like people, aircraft remember how they were treated, and they respond better to patience than force. The advice was practical, but Lucas heard deeper wisdom in the words. Montana Bell had been sleeping for 78 years, carrying secrets that had shaped lives and communities in ways no one fully understood. Waking her up would require more than mechanical skillet, would require careful consideration of what happened when powerful truths were finally allowed to take flight. A sound outside made Rex raise his head and growl softly. Lucas looked up from the manual to see headlights sweeping across the hangar entrance. It was 3:30 in the morning, too late for casual visitors and too early for scheduled deliveries. Elena stirred as Lucas moved toward the hangar door, her teacher's instincts automatically cataloging potential threats. "What is it?" she whispered. "Company," Lucas said quietly, recognizing the expensive purr of the engine that was winding down outside. "Blackstone." Richard Blackstone emerged from his black SUV, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people in Cedar Falls made in a month. He was accompanied by two men. Lucas didn't recognize well-dressed professionals who moved with the alert confidence of people accustomed to handling problems that required discretion. "Mr. Reyes," Blackstone said, his voice carrying the artificial warmth of a predator trying to appear friendly. "Working late, I see. Admirable dedication." Lucas stepped into the hangar doorway, positioning himself to block Blackstone's view of the interior. Kind of an odd time for a social call. "Business never sleeps," Blackstone replied, gesturing to his companions. "These are my associates, Mr. Crane and Mr. Wells. They represent certain interests that have become concerned about your restoration project." Elena had quietly moved to the workbench, where the hidden documents were secured in a locked toolbox. Rex positioned himself between her and the visitors, his hackles raised just enough to communicate displeasure without appearing threatening. Crane was the older of the two men, with grey hair and the kind of expensive dental work that suggested government connections. "Mr. Reyes," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "we understand you may have discovered certain materials during your restoration work. Materials of historical significance that would be better preserved in appropriate archival facilities." "Such as?" Lucas asked, though he already knew where the conversation was heading. Wells stepped forward, consulting a tablet that probably contained more information about Lucas than he would have been comfortable knowing. Documents, electronic equipment, items that might relate to classified operations conducted during World War II. Lucas felt the familiar anger that had sustained him through every impossible challenge his father had ever set before him. These men spoke about Montana Bell's secrets like they were discussing the weather, as if the lives and reputations at stake were just numbers in a cost-benefit analysis. "Funny thing about historical materials," Lucas said, his voice deliberately casual. "They tend to be most valuable when they're preserved in the context where they're found. Taking them out of that context can change their meaning entirely." Blackstone's facade of friendliness slipped slightly. "Mr. Reyes, you may not fully appreciate the sensitivity of what you're dealing with. Some information is classified not just for national security reasons, but to protect innocent people from having their private lives exposed to public scrutiny." Elena stepped forward from behind the wing, her notebook in hand, and her expression showing the kind of calm determination that had made her an effective teacher in challenging situations. "Mr. Blackstone," she said politely, "I'm curious about something. How exactly did you know that Mr. Reyes had found classified materials? We haven't shared that information with anyone outside the immediate restoration team." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Lucas saw Crane and Wells exchange glances that suggested Elena had identified a problem they hadn't anticipated. Blackstone recovered quickly, but not quickly enough to hide his momentary uncertainty. "There are always rumors when vintage aircraft are restored. People speculate about what might be found." "Speculation is one thing," Elena continued, her voice remaining conversational despite the tension filling the hangar. "But you seem to know specific details about what was discovered and where it's located. That suggests either remarkable intuition or access to information that should have been classified for nearly 80 years. Lucas realized that Elena's teaching experience included handling difficult parents and administrators who tried to manipulate situations through intimidation and false authority. She was applying those same skills to men who were accustomed to getting their way through pressure and implied threats. Crane stepped forward, apparently deciding that subtlety was no longer effective. "Mr. Reyes, let me be direct. The materials you've found relate to a lawful government operation conducted during wartime. Those materials remain classified, and possessing them without proper authorization is a federal crime." "Interesting," Lucas said, consulting his father's flight manual as if looking for guidance on a technical problem. "Because according to the documents we found, the operation was specifically designed to be terminated and all records destroyed, which suggests that the materials aren't officially classified anymore, they're just embarrassing." Wells pulled out his phone and began taking pictures of the hangar's interior, focusing on Montana Bell and the equipment visible around the restoration area. "We'll need to conduct a complete search of the aircraft and workspace to ensure that all relevant materials are properly secured." Rex stood up, his ears flattened and his stance communicating that photography without permission was not acceptable behavior in his territory. The dog's growing displeasure seemed to make all three visitors uncomfortable. Elena moved to Lucas's side, presenting a united front that had formed naturally over the weeks of working together. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to establishing classroom boundaries, "this is private property, and you're here without invitation at 3:30 in the morning. Unless you have a warrant or other legal authority, I suggest you schedule an appointment during normal business hours." Blackstone's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the arrogance and entitlement that Lucas had sensed from their first meeting. "This is bigger than your little restoration project," he said. "There are powerful people who have worked very hard to build lives and careers that could be destroyed by information that should have been buried decades ago." "Maybe," Lucas said, closing the flight manual and looking directly at Blackstone. "But that's their choice to make, not yours, and it's definitely not mine." The three men stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment, apparently realizing that their combination of threats and appeals to authority had failed to achieve the desired result. Lucas could see them recalculating their approach, trying to determine whether escalation or retreat would be more effective. Finally, Crane pulled out a business card and offered it to Lucas. "When you're ready to discuss this matter reasonably, call that number. Don't wait too long, some opportunities expire without warning." As the three men walked back to their SUV, Elena moved closer to Lucas. "Well," she said quietly, "I think we can officially conclude that this is about more than just a vintage aircraft restoration." Lucas watched the taillights disappear into the darkness, then turned back toward Montana Bell. The plane sat in the hangar like a sleeping giant, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. In 3 days, she would either fly again or become the property of people who saw her only as a source of leverage over others. "The question is," Lucas said, opening his father's flight manual to a section about emergency procedures, "what do we do when the most important flight of your life is also the most dangerous one you'll ever attempt?" Rex settled back onto his blanket with a satisfied grunt, apparently pleased that the intruders had been discouraged without requiring more direct intervention. The dog's confidence in his human's ability to handle complex threats was both touching and slightly intimidating. Elena returned to her chair beside the workbench, but Lucas could see that sleep would not be coming easily for either of them. The final 3 days of the restoration would require not just mechanical skill, but the kind of courage that comes from choosing to do the right thing, even when powerful people are determined to stop you. Montana Bell's original flight manual lay open to a page about navigating in challenging weather conditions, and Miguel's annotations seemed to speak directly to their current situation. When visibility is poor and the winds are against you, the only safe course is to trust your instruments and remember that every storm eventually passes. Some flights required more than skill and preparation. They required faith that the principles guiding you were strong enough to overcome the forces working against you. Day 30 arrived with perfect weather-clear skies, minimal wind, and the kind of mountain air that made flying feel like the natural state of all things with wings. Lucas stood beside Montana Bell at dawn, wearing his father's vintage aviator goggles and running through the pre-flight checklist one final time. The plane was magnificent. 3 weeks of meticulous work had transformed the rusted wreck into an aircraft that looked ready to rejoin the war it had left 78 years ago. Her fabric covering was taut and gleaming, her engine cowling polished to mirror brightness, and her instruments restored to factory specifications. Lucas's father's propeller hub caught the morning sunlight like a mechanical jewel, spinning lazily in the mountain breeze. Elena stood beside the hangar door, her laptop open to a live stream that would broadcast the test flight to aviation enthusiasts around the world. Word had spread through vintage aircraft communities, and Montana Bell's resurrection had become something larger than a local restoration project. She was now a symbol of what was possible when skill, determination, and community support combined to attempt the impossible. Rex had positioned himself at what he apparently considered a safe distance from the propeller, but close enough to monitor the proceedings with the vigilant attention of a dog who understood that this morning represented the culmination of everything his humans had been working toward. The entire town of Cedar Falls had gathered at the municipal airport to witness the test flight. Joe Henderson stood with his wife near the terminal building. Martha Peterson had closed the diner for the morning, and Tom Bradley had brought his grandson from the university to see history in the making. Even Frank Morrison had emerged from his ranch to watch, standing apart from the crowd but clearly invested in the outcome. Lucas performed the final engine checks with movements that had become automatic over 3 decades of aviation work. Oil pressure, normal. Fuel flow, steady. Ignition systems, both magnetos, firing properly. His father's voice echoed in his memory, guiding him through procedures that Miguel had performed thousands of times on aircraft that ranged from crop dusters to military transports. The aviator goggles had belonged to Miguel during his service in Vietnam, and wearing them now felt like carrying his father's blessing into the cockpit. Lucas had found them wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom of his father's toolbox, along with a note that read, "For the day when you're ready to stop fixing airplanes and start flying them again." Lucas hadn't flown solo in over 2 years, not since the financial pressures of keeping the hangar operational had forced him to sell his own aircraft. But Montana Bell responded to his touch like an old friend, her controls smooth and precise despite decades of inactivity. Blackstone, Crane, and Wells stood near the terminal building, watching the proceedings with the predatory patience of vultures waiting for roadkill. They had arrived an hour earlier in a convoy that included what looked like a mobile command center disguised as a recreational vehicle. Lucas didn't need to see inside to know that they were prepared to take possession of Montana Bell and her secrets the moment his test flight ended in failure. Elena approached the cockpit, carrying a thermos of coffee and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "Last chance for breakfast?" she said, her voice carefully controlled despite the tension that was radiating from her like heat from an engine. Lucas accepted the coffee gratefully, using the familiar ritual of checking fuel levels and control surfaces to manage his own pre-flight nerves. "Any word from the families?" Elena nodded, consulting her notebook. "I reached everyone on the surveillance list whose descendants still live in the area. They're all here this morning, and they all understand what's at stake. Whatever happens, they want to be part of deciding what comes next." Lucas looked across the crowd and saw faces he'd known his entire life, people whose grandparents and great-grandparents had been investigated during the war, people who had built their lives and careers without knowing that evidence of those investigations had been hidden in a plane sitting forgotten at their local airport. Sarah Patterson stood near the back of the crowd, having driven up from Billings where she worked as a nurse. She'd responded to Elena's message with characteristic directness. "If this affects my family's history, I want to be there." Her presence was complicated and welcome in equal measure, a reminder of roads not taken and connections that time hadn't entirely severed. "Engine start in 5 minutes," Lucas announced, settling into the pilot's seat and adjusting the goggles that carried his father's courage as well as his blessing. Elena leaned against the cockpit door, and Lucas caught the scent of her perfume, something floral and clean that had become as familiar as the smell of aviation fuel and metal polish. "Lucas," she said quietly, "whatever happens up there, you've already won. You've brought this community together in ways that matter more than any bet." Lucas started the engine, and Montana Bell's Continental 0170 caught immediately, settling into the steady rhythm that indicated perfect timing and compression. The sound drew cheers from the crowd and caused Rex to bark once in apparent approval before settling back into his supervisory position. The taxi to the runway gave Lucas time to feel Montana Bell's personality through the controls. She was stable and responsive, with none of the quirks or hesitations that might indicate hidden problems. His father's propeller hub provided smooth power delivery, and the rebuilt instruments showed readings that were textbook perfect. As he reached the end of the runway and began his final run-up procedures, Lucas saw Blackstone speaking urgently into a satellite phone, while Crane and Wells positioned themselves near what looked like recording equipment. They were preparing to document his failure with the thoroughness of people who understood that successful manipulation required credible evidence. But Montana Bell felt eager beneath his hands, like a racehorse approaching the starting gate. Her engine note was pure and strong, her controls precise and immediate. Lucas had rebuilt every system himself, using parts and techniques that represented 3 generations of aviation knowledge passed down from his father and grandfather. Elena's voice crackled through the handheld radio clipped to his belt. "Montana Bell, you are cleared for takeoff. Show them what you're made of." Lucas advanced the throttle to full power, released the brakes, and felt Montana Bell leap forward with the enthusiasm of an aircraft that had been waiting 78 years to remember what flight felt like. The takeoff roll was smooth and straight, and when he pulled back on the yoke, she lifted off with the grace of a bird, returning to its natural element. Cedar Falls spread out beneath him like a living map, the valley where Theodore Cedar had first dreamed of connecting remote communities through the magic of flight. Montana Belle climbed steadily toward the mountains, her engine singing with the satisfaction of a machine restored to its true purpose. For the first time in 3 years, Lucas Reyes was exactly where he belonged. Montana Belle soared over Cedar Falls like a time machine returning to life, her shadow racing across the valley floor where Theodore Cedar had first dreamed of bringing aviation to the Montana wilderness. From 500 feet, Lucas could see the entire community spread out below the town that had forgotten its aviation heritage and the people who were now witnessing its restoration. The flight was perfect. Montana Belle responded to every control input with the precision of a surgical instrument, her engine maintaining steady power and her instruments showing readings that would have made Miguel Reyes proud. Lucas performed a series of gentle turns and climbs, testing her stability and control characteristics while staying within sight of the airport where the entire population of Cedar Falls was watching his every move. Elena's voice crackled through the radio, barely containing her excitement. "Montana Belle, how are you doing up there?" "Like she was born to fly," Lucas responded, banking into a turn that showcased the plane's graceful lines to the crowd below. "All systems normal, handling characteristics excellent. She's remembering what she was built for." Through his father's aviator goggles, Lucas could see the crowd gathered around the airport terminal, their faces turned skyward with expressions of wonder and pride. Cars had stopped along the highway as drivers pulled over to watch the vintage aircraft perform her resurrection flight. Even from this altitude, he could see people pointing and taking photographs, documenting the moment when Cedar Falls reclaimed its identity as an aviation community. Montana Belle's Continental engine purred with contentment, her propeller hub crafted by Miguel's hands 40 years ago spinning with mechanical perfection. Lucas could feel his father's presence in every response of the controls, every smooth transition between flight attitudes. The restoration had become more than a mechanical project. It was a bridge between generations of aviators who understood that some dreams were too important to let die. As he completed his 4th circuit of the valley, Lucas spotted movement near the airport that made his pulse quicken. Blackstone's convoy was repositioning itself closer to the runway, and he could see what looked like law enforcement vehicles approaching from town. The vultures were gathering, prepared to claim their prize the moment Montana Belle's wheels touched the ground. But Lucas had one more demonstration to complete. He keyed the radio and spoke to Elena with the calm confidence of a pilot who knew his aircraft was capable of exceeding every expectation. Montana Belle requesting permission for a low pass over the field. "I want everyone to see what she can really do." Elena's response came immediately. "Permission granted, Montana Belle. Show them something they'll never forget." Lucas descended toward the airport in a gentle dive that built airspeed while maintaining perfect control. Montana Belle accelerated smoothly, her engine note rising to a triumphant crescendo as she approached the runway at an altitude of just 50 feet. The crowd scattered to safe positions as several thousand pounds of vintage aircraft swept over their heads with the grace of an eagle returning to its eyrie. The low pass was flawless, straight, level, and executed with the precision that demonstrated not just successful restoration but masterful piloting. As Montana Belle climbed away from the airport, Lucas heard cheers through his open cockpit windows, a sound that carried across the valley like a celebration of everything that was possible when people refused to accept defeat. Elena's voice on the radio was thick with emotion. "Lucas, that was absolutely magnificent. You've just proven that dreams don't have expiration dates." As he positioned Montana Belle for final approach, Lucas could see Elena standing beside the runway with a piece of paper in her hands. The crowd had formed a welcoming committee that stretched from the terminal to the taxiway, their faces showing the kind of pride that comes from witnessing something truly extraordinary. The landing was as perfect as the flight, a gentle touchdown that demonstrated Montana Belle's eagerness to complete her return to active service. As Lucas taxied toward the hangar, he could see Blackstone and his associates moving toward the aircraft with the aggressive purposefulness of people who had waited long enough to claim what they considered rightfully theirs. But something else was happening that clearly hadn't been part of their plan. Elena was addressing the crowd with the confident authority of someone accustomed to managing large groups, and the townspeople were responding with the coordinated movement of a community that had made collective decisions. Lucas shut down the engine and climbed out of the cockpit to find himself surrounded by neighbors, friends, and people he'd known his entire life. Their applause was thunderous, but underneath the celebration, he could sense something more significant, a shared understanding that Montana Bell's successful flight represented more than just winning a bet. Elena rushed forward with a beautifully crafted wooden certificate in her hands, the edges decorated with hand-drawn aircraft and mountain scenes. On behalf of the community of Cedar Falls, she announced loud enough for everyone to hear, I present this certificate commemorating the successful restoration and first flight of Montana Bell, and recognizing Lucas Reyes for proving that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to give up. The certificate was signed by what looked like every adult in town, their names creating a testament to community support that had made the impossible possible. Rex bounded toward Lucas with the enthusiastic joy of a dog whose humans had accomplished something magnificent, his tail wagging so hard his entire body wiggled with excitement. But the celebration was interrupted by Blackstone's approach, flanked by Crane and Wells, and followed by two men in dark suits who moved with the professional bearing of federal agents. The crowd's mood shifted as people recognized the threat these newcomers represented to their moment of triumph. Congratulations, Mr. Reyes, Blackstone said, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone who believed victory was still within reach. You've successfully completed the restoration within the specified time frame. According to our agreement, the aircraft now belongs to you. Lucas removed his father's aviator goggles and faced Blackstone with the calm confidence of someone who had just proven that skill and determination could overcome wealth and manipulation. That's right. Montana Bell is mine, legally and completely. Of course, Blackstone continued smoothly, there's still the matter of the classified materials that were discovered during the restoration process. My associates here have the authority to secure those materials for proper governmental handling. One of the federal agents stepped forward, displaying credentials that identified him as a representative of the National Archives. Reyes, we understand you found documents and equipment related to historical intelligence operations. Those materials need to be transferred to appropriate federal custody for evaluation and preservation. Elena moved to Lucas's side, the community certificate still in her hands like a shield against outside interference. Agent Morrison, she said, having apparently researched the man's identity in advance. I'm curious about the legal basis for that seizure. The materials in question were found in privately owned property during a lawful restoration project. Agent Morrison consulted a tablet that probably contained more legal authority than Lucas wanted to think about. The materials relate to classified operations conducted under wartime emergency powers. They remain government property regardless of where they were found. Elena smiled, with the patient expression of someone who had anticipated this exact conversation. That would be true if the operations in question hadn't been specifically terminated and ordered destroyed by congressional mandate in 1946, which means the materials are historical artifacts, not classified documents. The crowd had formed a protective semicircle around Lucas and Elena, their body language communicating that they were prepared to defend their neighbors against outside threats. Tom Bradley stepped forward, still wearing his hardware store apron, but carrying himself with surprising authority. Agent Morrison, Bradley said, I believe you'll find that several of us here have direct personal interest in those historical artifacts. Our families were subjects of the surveillance operations in question, which gives us legal standing to participate in decisions about what happens to the evidence. Sarah Patterson emerged from the crowd, moving with the determined stride of someone who had spent 3 years regretting words left unspoken. Lucas, she said, her voice carrying the complex mixture of pride and regret that comes from watching someone you once loved achieve something extraordinary. "I owe you an apology. I thought you were living in the past, but you were actually building something for the future." Lucas felt his heart skip as Sarah approached, looking older but somehow more confident than she had 3 years ago. "Sarah, Let me finish," she interrupted gently. "I was wrong about what mattered to you, and I was wrong about what your father's legacy meant. This project, this community response, this is what happens when someone chooses to build something larger than themselves." Elena watched the exchange with the gracious understanding of someone who recognized that some conversations were necessary regardless of their personal cost. Her expression showed no jealousy, only the quiet confidence of someone who knew where her own affections were valued and returned. Blackstone's patience had apparently reached its limit. "This is all very touching," he said, his voice cutting through the emotional reunion like a knife, "but it doesn't change the legal realities. Those documents contain information that could damage innocent people if they became public. They need to be secured by people who understand the implications." Lucas looked around at the faces of his community people whose grandparents and great-grandparents had been investigated without their knowledge, people who had built lives and careers without knowing that evidence of those investigations had been hidden in their midst for nearly 80 years. "You're right about one thing," Lucas said, addressing Blackstone directly. "Those documents could damage innocent people, which is exactly why the people most affected by them should be the ones who decide what happens next." Elena stepped forward, holding up the community certificate as if it were a declaration of independence. "Blackstone, Agent Morrison, I'd like to introduce you to the Cedar Falls Historical Preservation Committee, which was legally formed this morning under Montana state law. As representatives of the families most directly affected by the Operation Nightwatch surveillance program, we claim legal custody of all materials related to that operation for the purpose of historical preservation and community healing." The federal agents exchanged glances that suggested Elena had identified a legal strategy they hadn't anticipated. Blackstone's expression shifted from confident to concerned as he realized that his carefully planned seizure was being challenged by people who understood both the law and their own rights. Montana Belle sat behind them like a witness to democracy in action, her polished surfaces reflecting the morning sun and the faces of people who had discovered that sometimes the most important victories were won not in the air, but on the ground where communities decided to stand together against forces that threatened their autonomy. Rex positioned himself between the townspeople and the federal agents, his stance communicating that while he was prepared to be diplomatic, he was also ready to defend his extended pack if circumstances required more direct intervention. The battle for Montana Belle's secrets was just beginning, but Lucas realized that the most important victory had already been won. Cedar Falls had remembered who it was and what it was capable of achieving when its people chose to support each other rather than surrender to outside pressure. 6 months later, Lucas stood beneath a newly installed wooden sign that read, "Reyes, Martinez Aviation Services," in elegant carved letters. Watching Elena organize a group of elementary school students for their first aviation education field trip, Montana Belle sat in the center of the hangar like a museum piece that still remembered how to fly, her polished surfaces reflecting the excited faces of children who were learning that dreams could take physical form if you worked hard enough and refused to give up. The transformation of both the hangar and the community had exceeded everyone's expectations. Elena's decision to leave teaching and become Lucas's full business partner had brought organizational skills and educational vision that complemented his mechanical expertise perfectly. Together, they had created something neither could have achieved: Alonia thriving aviation service that combined aircraft maintenance with community education and historical preservation. Rex had appointed himself official greeter and safety supervisor, approaching each group of young visitors with the dignified patience of a dog who understood that his job was to help children feel welcome while keeping them safely away from spinning propellers and sharp edges. The students invariably fell in love with him, and several had already announced plans to become veterinarians, specifically to help dogs like Rex. The hidden wartime documents had been handled exactly as Elena had proposed, through community decision-making that honored both historical truth and personal privacy. The families affected by the Operation Night Watch surveillance had met, discussed, and unanimously agreed to donate the materials to the Montana Historical Society, with the understanding that they would be preserved but not publicly displayed without family consent. Blackstone and his associates had retreated after discovering that their legal authority was less comprehensive than they had assumed. The federal agents had been professional but frustrated, eventually concluding that the community's approach to handling sensitive historical materials was both legally sound and politically wise. The restoration project had inspired other communities throughout Montana to investigate their own aviation heritage. Cedar Falls had become a destination for vintage aircraft enthusiasts and history buffs, bringing tourism revenue that had allowed several local businesses to expand and hire additional employees. Martha Peterson had opened a small cafe specifically for pilots, complete with aviation memorabilia and stories about Theodore Cedar's pioneering flights. Lucas walked through the hangar, checking on the 3 aircraft currently undergoing restoration: a 1952 Cessna 170 that belonged to a rancher from Wyoming, a 1941 Stearman biplane being rebuilt for a collector in Oregon, and a 1960s Piper Cherokee that would serve as the training aircraft for the flight instruction program Elena had convinced him to start. Each project carried its own challenges and rewards, but none had been as transformative as Montana Belle's resurrection. She flew regularly now, serving as both advertisement for their restoration services and inspiration for the community that had supported her return to the sky. Lucas had taken Elena flying several times, and her delight in seeing the world from above had reminded him why he had fallen in love with aviation in the first place. The sound of footsteps on concrete made him look up to see Elena approaching with her usual purposeful stride, carrying coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose day was proceeding according to plan. She had adapted to aviation life with the same systematic approach she brought to everything else, mastering radio procedures and weather interpretation with the dedication of someone who understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between safe flights and dangerous mistakes. "The museum group is arriving this afternoon," Elena said, settling onto the stool that had become permanently positioned beside the workbench. "And I got confirmation that the Smithsonian wants to include Montana Belle in their traveling exhibition about civilian contributions to wartime intelligence." Lucas accepted the coffee gratefully, using the familiar ritual of reviewing the day's schedule to appreciate how much his life had changed since the morning when he had signed Blackstone's bet. "Any word from the film crew?" Elena consulted her notebook, which had grown into a comprehensive business management system that tracked everything from parts orders to maintenance schedules. "They want to do the interview next week, and they're particularly interested in the community response angle." The producer said stories about people working together to achieve impossible things are exactly what audiences need right now. Through the open hangar door, Lucas could see Montana Belle's shadow moving across the tarmac as she sat in the afternoon sunshine, her fabric covering taut and her metal surfaces gleaming with the care that came from daily attention and genuine affection. She had become more than a restored aircraft. She was a symbol of what was possible when people chose to believe in each other's dreams. Rex wandered over from his supervisory position near the school group, tail wagging with the contentment of a dog whose life had exceeded all reasonable expectations for companionship and purpose. He had become something of a local celebrity, appearing in newspaper articles about the restoration and serving as unofficial mascot for Cedar Falls' renewed identity as an aviation community. "Sarah called this morning," Elena said, her voice carefully neutral, despite the complex history involved. She wanted to congratulate us on the engagement announcement and to let you know that her nursing supervisor is interested in commissioning a restoration of their hospital's vintage air ambulance. Lucas smiled, thinking about the awkward but ultimately healing conversation he'd had with Sarah 3 months earlier. She had driven up from Billings specifically to apologize for her letter and to acknowledge that his dedication to preserving his father's legacy had been exactly the kind of commitment the world needed more of, not less. I told her we'd be honored to take on the project. Elena continued. It seems appropriate that Montana Bell's success should help preserve other aircraft that were built to serve their communities. Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that made Lucas's pulse quicken despite having participated in selecting its contents 2 weeks earlier. Speaking of serving the community, she said with a smile that transformed her from business partner to the woman he loved. I believe you have something to ask me. Lucas set down his coffee and took the box with hands that were steadier when working on aircraft engines than when contemplating marriage proposals. Elena Martinez, he said, opening the box to reveal the engagement ring they had chosen. Together a simple band, set with a small diamond that caught the hangar lights like a star. Will you marry me and help me turn this place into everything it's capable of becoming? Elena's answer was immediate and radiant. Yes, absolutely yes. Though I should warn you that I have plans for expanding our educational programs, and I think Rex deserves his own office. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Rex appeared beside them with his tail wagging and his expression showing the satisfied approval of a dog who had successfully orchestrated the romance he had been encouraging since Elena's first visit to the hangar. Lucas slipped the ring onto Elena's finger, and she held up her hand to admire how the diamond caught the afternoon light streaming through the hangar doors. Montana Bell sat behind them like a benevolent witness, her presence a reminder that some restorations were about more than returning things to their original condition. Sometimes they were about discovering what something could become when it was given the chance to exceed its original purpose. The new hangar sign cast its shadow across the concrete floor, marking the spot where 2 people had found each other while working to save something that had been abandoned by everyone else. Cedar Falls had remembered its aviation heritage. Montana Bell had returned to the sky, and Lucas Reyes had discovered that the most important repairs were often the ones that fixed things he hadn't realized were broken. Rex settled onto his favorite blanket with a contented sigh, apparently satisfied that his humans had finally figured out what he had known from the beginning, that some partnerships were worth whatever effort was required to make them work. Outside, the sound of an approaching aircraft made all 3 of them look up. Montana Bell would soon have company in the sky above Cedar Falls, just as Theodore Cedar had originally envisioned when he dreamed of a community connected to the world through the magic of flight. Some dreams just needed the right people to believe in them strongly enough to make them real.